Speak a little louder. Thank you all for coming out on this wonderful sunny summer afternoon. I grew up in Oneida County, right square in the middle of New York State. And one of the names I heard now and then growing up was Butterfield. I didn't think too much of it until a few years ago when COVID hit, and all of a sudden I was looking around for something to write about to pass the time. And I thought, well, I'll see if there's anything on this guy. He was chief of staff of the Army of the Potomac during Chancellorsville and Gettysburg, so there must be something. And to my amazement, nobody had ever written even a big article, much less a biography of him. So I started researching him, and I was amazed at how much I found. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly so that we have time at the end for you to ask questions or time for you to wake up in case I put you to sleep or whatever the case might be. During the Civil War centennial, New York State published a series of pamphlets on different aspects of the war from the perspective of New York. And the editor said that beyond argument, Butterfield was the fightingest general this state has given to the Civil War, which is quite a bit to say since New York was the largest state in the Union at the time and obviously had a large number of general officers as well. But then he went on to say that he marveled that the name Butterfield is not conspicuous in Civil War literature. Well, it's over a half century later, and I think for the most part that's still true. When you look at histories of the Civil War, you occasionally see his name in passing. Usually around the Gettysburg campaign, his name is mentioned, not always in the most admirable of light. If there's any kind of discussion about him at all, it's usually relatively negative. So I was trying to find out what really is behind this guy. One of the things I discovered is historians tend to repeat themselves. You know, somebody in the 1890s will write something, 20 years later another person picks it up and writes the same thing, 20 years after that somebody else. So what I tried to do is to go back to original sources to find out what people who knew Butterfield thought and what people who were involved in the experiences he was involved in thought. So as we go through this, I have a number of quotations, and I put them in there simply so you can see what people who were actually alive at the time and knew him and experienced these things actually thought about him, rather than what later historians decided to write about. So he's born in October of 1831 in Utica, New York. His father was John Butterfield, who was a heavy investor in a lot of emerging companies. He and Ezra Cornell were the first people to invest in a telegraph line from New York City to Buffalo. And in the late 1850s, Butterfield obtained a contract from the United States government for overland freight and mail delivery from the East Coast to the West Coast. So Butterfield's company was the first company to establish a regular schedule for passengers, freight, and mail, starting at St. Louis and going out to the Pacific Coast, Los Angeles and San Francisco. And he also founded something else you might be marginally familiar with today. It's called American Express. So Butterfield came into a pretty wealthy family and had a lot of advantages. He graduated from Union College in Schenectady, New York in 1849 with a BA degree. Was going to study law, but he found out that under New York state law, he was way too young to get a law license. So he decided instead to take a trip through the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi, and he ended up in New Orleans. In New Orleans, he came face to face with slavery and went away thinking that this is a huge problem that's not going to be solved very easily. So he gets back to New York State, and he's named the general superintendent for the Eastern Division of American Express. Now, mind you, he's fresh out of college, has no experience, but it probably helped him that his father owned the company. So he moves to New York City, enlists in the 71st New York State Militia, and he writes, "There came to mind a plain duty to prepare to the best of my ability for what seemed the inevitable upon every patriot and lover of his country who had any desire to discharge his duty. I was laughed at and jeered for my explanations, made privately to personal friends." So he thinks something is on the horizon that's not going to be very good. In the late 1850s, the state militia is reorganized, and Butterfield is named colonel of the 12th New York State Militia. He gets a letter from a friend in Virginia asking him where he stands on the issues of the day. And he writes back, "I should most sincerely regret that any combination of circumstances should place me in a position to be called upon to use any portion of the knowledge or skill I may possess in a military way against our erring brethren of the South." But, he swore an oath to the Constitution, so that's what he's going to do. What I find really interesting, other than his explanation, is the date. He writes this response one day before Fort Sumter is fired on. There's a picture of old Dan with the officers of the 12th Militia in Washington, D.C. He had about 300 men in his regiment, way too small to send off to Washington. So within the space of about a month, he recruited another 600 men, went off to D.C. Obviously, these men weren't trained, so he spent another month training them. And then eventually, his regiment is one of the regiments that marches by in review for the president and for General in Chief Winfield Scott. After the review is over, Scott calls him up to the reviewing stand and says to him, "Your regiment, sir, marched like regulars," which was a pretty good compliment for any militia officer, much less one who 2/3 of his regiment had only been in the service for a month. So impressed was Scott that he named the 12th New York State Militia as the lead regiment to lead the federal movement into Northern Virginia. And here's a interesting sketch from Harper's Weekly of the 12th New York leading the procession across Long Bridge, across the Potomac River into Northern Virginia. He missed his first Bull Run. Instead, his regiment was sent out to the Shenandoah Valley, where even though he's relatively new to the service, so was everybody else at that time, at least all the volunteer officers. He was senior enough to be named brigade commander. When the 90 days service of his regiment were up, there was nobody to replace them, so his regiment voted to remain in service 2 more weeks until somebody else could arrive to replace them. And then they head home, and he finds out that Winfield Scott has nominated him for brigadier general. So he gets a brigade in the 3rd Corps. One of the soldiers was Eugene Nash in the 44th New York. He says Butterfield was thought to be rather too strict. There was squad drill, mounting police, guard mounting police work, company drill, battalion drill, etc., etc., etc. And to fill in, there was guard duty, picket duty, lessons in tactics. The routine of daily duties was based on the assumption that 27 days constituted a day. Now, I'm assuming most of you, if not all of you, have probably seen the movie Gettysburg. And there's a little scene in there where they talk about how Butterfield devised this brigade call so that when this call went out, his troops would know the next order was for them, and they could distinguish it from brigade calls all around them. Soldiers being what they will, they came up with a little ditty to go with this, kind of rhyming it to the score of the music, Dan, 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 Butterfield, Butterfield. Some of the troops, because of his, shall we say, severity of drill, came up with some other lyrics, which were similar but not quite the same. Over the winter, he also writes camp and outpost duty for infantry. Now remember, by the end of 1861, the United States Army was larger than it had ever been in the entire history of the country. George Washington's army at its peak during the American Revolution was a little bit larger than a standard Army Corps in the Civil War. Nowhere near. So all of the training manuals were out of date. So Butterfield brought together some of the previous training manuals, updated them, and then added to them for the new larger armies that were in the field. O.O. Howard wrote, there was a great need for something that would adapt itself to new circumstances, where a large army was forming in the face of a hostile force. Butterfield's plan was simple, easily mastered by officers and men, and very effective in covering our large frontage. When Joe Hooker becomes commander of the Army of the Potomac, he orders that this be used as the training manual for the entire Army of the Potomac. And by mid-1864, it was being used throughout the entire Union Army as the official training manual for soldiers in the Union Army. Spring of 1862, George McClellan decides to launch his campaign. Confederate Army is roughly here. He decides to bypass the Confederate Army, land his army on the York Peninsula, from where he can make a lightning strike to Richmond. Well, if you've ever read anything about George McClellan, you know that he never did anything comparable to lightning. One of the things Butterfield encounters is Thaddeus Lowe's balloon corps. And he's one of the first officers to actually go up in a balloon, rising to 1,000 feet in the air. Now, I don't know if he was the first general officer or not, but if he wasn't, he was certainly close to it. So McClellan gives the Confederates time to move their army back to protect Richmond. So here's Joseph Johnston's Confederates. McClellan's army is roughly here. Johnston decides to outflank and get in behind McClellan to drive him away from Richmond. McClellan sends the nearest troops, Fitzjohn Porter's, and Porter is commanding the corps in which Butterfield's brigade is. So the result is the Battle of Hanover Courthouse. And Butterfield is called upon to attack the Confederate entrenchments, or not entrenchments, positions. He does so, and one of his regiments captures the first artillery piece taken in action. Now, there had been Confederate guns captured before, but they were all pieces in fortifications that were left behind when the Confederates abandoned them. So this is the first piece actually taken in action. And believe it or not, the Library of Congress has a photograph of this exact gun and caisson. Following the action, his officers gave him a set of silver spurs as a commemoration of his good conduct. Here's a picture of one of them. They're in the Oneida County Historical Society in New York, and I actually took a picture of this one. So after the battle, the lines are roughly like this, and you'll notice the Chickahominy River divides the Union Army into two pieces, with one corps north of it and the rest of the army south. So if you're an astute Confederate general, what are you going to do? You're going to try to attack that piece that's on one side of the river before it can be reinforced by troops on the other side of the river. So the Confederates reorganize their ranks somewhat, and then they launch an attack on Fitzjohn Porter's corps. The result is the Battle of Gaines' Mill. Federals roughly here, Confederates roughly here. The Confederate plan is to attack the Union left, draw in all of the reinforcements, and then when they've done that, they're going to attack the right, outflank it, and try and cut the Federals off from the river and capture them. So the first attack falls on Butterfield. The 83rd Pennsylvania in his front line starts to waver a little bit under the intense pressure. Butterfield has his horse shot from under him. A bullet goes through his cap, and another one bounces off his sword. And then the lieutenant colonel of the 83rd writes, "At this moment, Brigadier General Butterfield, amidst a galling fire from his lines of support in the rear and that of the enemy in the front, came coolly down the knoll, and sword in hand seized our colors, waving them repeatedly aloft, and by all mortal means encouraged the valor of our regiment." Confederates are driven back. The second attack falls a little bit to his right and begins to break through, so Butterfield takes his two reserve regiments and plugs the gap. Meanwhile, on the right, the Confederates are successful in outflanking the Union, and Fitzjohn Porter has to withdraw. Butterfield covers the withdrawal back across the river, and the Federal forces are withdrawn safely. Butterfield is nominated for a Medal of Honor, which he receives. The citation saying that he sees the colors of the 83rd Pennsylvania, etc., etc. So he's one of the first people awarded the Medal of Honor during the war. Following Gaines' Mill, the Federal Army retreats fights a number of different actions. Interestingly, they win most of them, but they still end up retreating. And at Malvern Hill, Butterfield again holds the left of the Federal line against repeated Confederate attacks. A colonel of the 12th New York writes, "When the heaviest cannonading was going on, the activity and spirit of our general gave life and confidence to the officers and men to my command. And wherever he rode, out or in, watching the progress of the fight, his presence was hailed by men with enthusiasm. Eventually, reinforcements arrive, and one of the first units to arrive is the Irish Brigade. General Marr writes, we were met by Brigadier General Butterfield, who, grasping the distinctive green flag of the leading regiment of the brigade, exhibited the ardor of a general who was personally interested in its honor, and thereby renewed and re-excited the spirit of the advance." His corps commander, Fitzjohn Porter, wrote, "Butterfield was certainly a splendid commander and a good model for anyone. Quick, brave, and his men had perfect confidence in him. Butterfield's conduct was admirable. He had no superior as a soldier among the young volunteer commanders who came under my personal notice." The author of the Fifth Corps history, William Powell, was a veteran of this campaign and these battles. He wrote, "All reports bear witness to the care, energy, and ability of General Butterfield in the handling of his brigade, and to his personal gallantry in inspiring and leading his troops." The Army under McClellan falls back to Harrison's Landing. There's been a high number of casualties. Butterfield's not feeling too well. He's diagnosed with malaria and camp fever. He's kind of morose. At night, the buglers play this song that was currently used by the armies as soldiers referred to it as lights out. It was like, you hear this call, it's time to turn out your lights, go to bed, and get a good night's sleep. He didn't like it. He thought it was too spry, too uplifting. It just didn't fit the occasion. So he calls Oliver Norton, his bugler, to his tent. And Norton later writes that Butterfield whistled a new tune and asked me to sound it. After this was done, not quite to his satisfaction at first, but after repeated trials, changing the name of some of the notes which were scribbled on the back of an envelope, all was finally arranged to suit the general. Butterfield then ordered the tune to be substituted in his brigade that night. And of course, the tune is Taps. The following night, nearby buglers came over and said to Norton, "What's that tune you played last night?" So it spreads to the division, and then the Corps, and then the entire Army of the Potomac. And then when the 11th and 12th Corps go west in this fall of 1863 to help relieve the siege of Chattanooga, it spreads to the Western armies, and by the end of the war, Taps is being used throughout the Union armies, and the rest, as they say, is history. By now, Robert E. Lee is in charge of the Confederate Army. Lee understands that McClellan is going nowhere, so he takes the Confederate Army and heads north. McClellan is ordered to send the Army of the Potomac back to D.C. to protect the capital. So most of the Army goes by ship up the Potomac River, but there wasn't enough high draft vessels, so they brought into use some shallow draft vessels, and Butterfield's command was ordered aboard one of these, or several of these. They went up the Rappahannock River, were landed, and had to march overland to Manassas Junction. And this was where things really get interesting. The division commander is George Morrell. Morrell is ordered to march from Bristow Station to Centerville the following morning. So the following morning, he leads off at the head of his division with one of his brigades. They get to Manassas Junction, they take the road to Centerville, and away they go. Butterfield happened to be second in line, and he was 300, 400, maybe even 500 yards behind. When Butterfield gets to Manassas Junction, he thinks he hears off to the left some firing, some shooting going on. And while he's trying to discern what this is, a staff officer rides up and says, the battle is going on over there, we're being attacked, we need you. Well, He's got orders to go to Centerville. So what does he do? He decides he's going to go to the sound of the guns. He turns left. The brigade following him follows him and turns left. And Butterfield shows up at the second Bull Run battlefield, finding out that he's actually now the senior officer present. So he takes command of the division, General Morrill being nowhere in sight. He's ordered to attack. He protests. He says, the Confederate line is way too strong. There's no way in the world my division of only 2 brigades is going to break through this. But he's ordered to attack anyway, so he does. And of course, he's repulsed. General Sykes writes, Butterfield's attack was gallantly made and gallantly maintained. And a captain in the brigade writes, in a few moments, Butterfield succeeded in rallying and reforming the brigade, and we were marched off the field in good order. We now felt secure in the hands of our general, as we had previous proofs of his bravery and judgment. So, nobody was very happy with General Morrill, so he's sent packing out of the way somewhere. Well, who is the senior officer in the division? Dan Butterfield. So now all of a sudden he's in command of a division, not a brigade. But his corps commander is Fitzjohn Porter. And Fitzjohn Porter is in the doghouse. General Pope has preferred charges against him for his conduct at Second Bull Run, and Porter is relieved and forced to undergo court-martial. Well, who's the next senior officer in the Corps? Dan Butterfield. So Dan Butterfield goes from being a militia colonel with no experience in April of 1861 to the early fall of 1862, about 15 months later, being a major general in charge of the entire 5th Corps of the Army of the Potomac. His men are kept in reserve during the bloodbath at Fredericksburg. He's called across the river into the fight late in the afternoon. 2 of his divisions end up making attacks and they're repulsed. And before the 3rd Division can be committed, General Burnside is finally convinced that this is hopeless and stops these suicidal attacks. Butterfield is charged with commanding the withdrawal across the river. So here he is in Fredericksburg with Confederate artillery on the heights outside of the city, surrounded with the river to his back and with Confederates to his front and to his flank. What is he going to do? Well, he waits until night when it gets dark. He tells the troops to wind blankets and coats and anything they can find around the wagon wheels to keep them quiet. He issues orders to keep everybody as quiet as possible. And overnight, and fortunately early in the morning there's a heavy fog, he withdraws the army across the river without losing a single gun, without losing a single wagon, without losing a single soldier. Butterfield is literally the last person to step foot on the pontoon bridge to cross the river before the pontoon bridge is taken away. Joe Hooker writes, to Butterfield, much praise is due for the spirit and energy displayed in the execution of orders and gallantry throughout the operation. Of course, Fredericksburg is a Union disaster. If you look at desertion rates, the end of December, the end of the month when the disaster took place, of 1862 is the only time during the entire war when the desertion rate in the Army of the Potomac was higher than it was in the Confederate Army. So this was an unmitigated disaster. One person who wasn't happy was George Meade. Meade was a major general. He outranked Butterfield. He was a West Point graduate, and he's leading a division, while Dan Butterfield, who Meade refers to as an amateur, is reading the 5th Corps. So he complains to Ambrose Burnside, who's commanding the Union Army, and he claims that he didn't ask to replace Butterfield, but obviously he did, because there's no reason in the world why he would complain otherwise. So Burnside replaces Butterfield with Meade, and Butterfield is crushed. He claims later that Burnside had told him his appointment was permanent, it was not temporary. But now all of a sudden, despite all of this positive praise throughout the first year and a half of the war, despite handling his troops well, according to everybody, all of a sudden he's replaced and he's without a command. He's alternately angry, discouraged, wondering what's going to happen next. Well, what happens next is Joe Hooker replaces Burnside, and Hooker appoints him chief of staff, essentially saving his career. Theodore Dodge became a noted historian after the war was over. He met Butterfield at this time. He wrote, "Butterfield's a young man, scarcely 30, rather handsome, wears a black mustache, stoutest face and figure, very cool and collected in his manner and very gentlemanly. The general received us very graciously and entertained us most pleasantly for an hour or so when we took our leave." Well, one of the things that I read constantly was how well Butterfield entertained the other officers and visiting dignitaries and friends. Well, Butterfield was one of the few people who could afford to, because when he went off to war, unlike most people, the company he worked for, American Express, the board of directors strangely voted to continue paying him his salary throughout the entire war. Of course, again, his father probably had no influence on this, I'm sure. So he had a lot of money to entertain people, and obviously there may have been some people who were jealous of that. Butterfield is probably most famous at this period for originating the different corps badges that were used. And he not only originated them, but he actually selected each one personally himself. When the 11th and 12th Corps go west in the fall of 1863, some of the Western soldiers say, "What are these things you're wearing on your," and he explains to them that each corps has a different one, each division has a different color. So the Western armies start to adopt them, and Butterfield actually designed the first one used by the Western Corps for the 14th Corps himself. But he's also heavily involved in reorganizing the Army of the Potomac as chief of staff. After Chancellorsville, a lot of the 2-year enlistments and a lot of the 9-month enlistments are up, and soldiers are returning home. New enlistments are coming in, so the entire Army needs really reorganizing, and Butterfield is heavily involved in that. Henry Slocum writes, "Hooker was very fortunate in having as his chief of staff Major General Daniel Butterfield, who was untiring in aiding and devising ways and means of putting and continuing the Army in its best possible condition of efficiency within the bounds of simplicity." Henry Tremaine, a staff officer at the Army headquarters, wrote, "Butterfield is entitled to an exceptional place in the history of that famous Army. In less than 3 months, the headquarters of the Army became transformed from a habitual depot of delays to a model of neatness and dispatch." And remember, this is Butterfield's forte. Now, he's not a professional military man. His forte is management. He managed the Eastern Division of American Express. His forte is getting things where they need to be on time. His forte is organizing management schemes to make that happen. So he's a perfect chief of staff. At Chancellorsville, we have the two armies facing each other near Fredericksburg. And Joe Hooker decides to do a wide flanking movement, which then forces Lee to divide his army. Butterfield's role in all of this is to stay in Falmouth and be the linchpin for communications. Hooker is leading this wide sweeping movement. General Sedgwick is commanding the troops in Fredericksburg and that area. You have federal troops in the Shenandoah Valley. You have the Navy, which is bringing in by ship supplies and stuff. You have several other commands located in the area. Butterfield's job as chief of staff is to keep all of these units informed of what everyone else is doing and pass along any information to any of those units that might be helpful in coping with the Confederates. So he's a liaison with the other commands, drafting orders. He coordinates reconnaissance, construction of the pontoon bridges, requisitioning supplies, distributing things to different commands that need them, supplies, mules, horses, whatever it might be. He's responsible for intelligence. They've just created, for the first time in American history, a single Bureau of Military Information under Colonel Sharp to gather information in a systematic way. And Butterfield's responsible for collating all of this and sending it out to the different commands who might need this information. He's responsible for counterintelligence, making sure that people crossing the lines are not taking vital military information to the enemy, especially, need I say it, journalists, who are very fond of writing Union Army plans in the New York Times, which of course the Confederates get and read and know everything that's going on. So Butterfield's the linchpin of communications. Chancellorsville, of course, turns out to be another disaster. But if you read through the records, there's almost no criticism of Butterfield at all. On the other hand, there's a notable lack of commentary about how bad communications were. Communications seem to have gone pretty well. So in the wake of Chancellorsville, there's two major problems. One is readying the Army for a new campaign. Over 20,000 troops leave the Army because their expiration of their terms are up. And you have thousands of people coming in again. So once again, the Army has to be resupplied, reorganized, and made ready for the campaign. And they have to determine Lee's strength and his plans. Well, Butterfield is intimately involved in both of these. If we look at a map of Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, Lee begins by moving west and then moving north into Maryland and Pennsylvania, and eventually he's followed by Joe Hooker and the Federal Army. The Union Army has about 90,000 men. Think about this. If you stretch out 90,000 men on one road, marching 2 or 3 or 4 abreast, they're going to cover half of Virginia. Clearly that's not workable. So it's Butterfield's job to manage all of this. He needs to know the condition of the roads, whether the bridges are strong enough to support artillery and wagons, whether the fords are shallow enough at this time of year for infantry to pass or for wagons to pass. He needs to know alternate routes. You can't have everybody marching on one road. They have to be marching on alternate routes, otherwise you're never going to get anywhere. The routes have to be sufficiently separated so that they don't cross each other and you end up with congestion points like a stoplight in Chicago when you're trying to get somewhere. So this is an intricate ballet that has to be managed, and all of it's managed by Dan Butterfield. As most of you probably know, the Chief of the Army, the Commander-in-Chief, Henry Halleck, disagreed with Joe Hooker on a number of things, and eventually he gives him the boot. And he's replaced by none other than George Meade. Interesting. The first thing Meade does is to ask Seth Williams if he will replace Dan Butterfield. And Williams says no. So he asks Andrew Humphreys to replace Butterfield. And Butterfield says, well, you really ought to keep him. He's the only one that knows where the Army is. When Hooker was replaced, he stuck around long enough for the change of command and then left. So the Army spread out over 2 states. Who knows where it is? Dan Butterfield. So Meade asked Gouverneur Warren, will you consent to be Chief of Staff? And Warren essentially says, and these are my words, are you nuts? Nobody knows where the Army is except Dan Butterfield. So Butterfield is kept. And he's largely responsible for informing Meade about the disposition of the Army, what orders Hooker has given, and what the intent has been up to this point. He's also charged with drafting orders to consolidate the Army, to coordinate the intelligence, to map the roadway, everything he did previous to the Chancellorsville campaign as well. And there's an added problem here. The Army's in motion. So every single day, the Army headquarters is somewhere else. Every single day, every single corps headquarters is somewhere else. Every division headquarters, they're all in movement. They're all in a different place tomorrow than they were today. So he has to keep track of where all these different places are, the best routes to get orders to them, and so forth. He needs to track where they are. He also needs to try and track the safest routes that seem to be more secure, where the couriers are less likely to run into Confederate cavalry or raiders. What Butterfield does is to assign 2 Signal Corps officers to each headquarters. One of them, who's an expert in these wigwag flags that they used to use, and one of them who is an expert in the emerging telegraph system. Captain Lemuel Norton wrote, this was provided a rapid means of communication with the 1st, 11th, and 12th Corps, the units that were closest to the Confederates at the time. Historian Peter Tsiras later wrote that the changes were a vital step in creating a near real-time communication and intelligence system. So Butterfield is largely responsible for moving the Army toward a more modern kind of communication system that did not rely simply on couriers taking orders back and forth on horseback. Gouverneur Warren wrote, the troops continued to move on just the same as if the command had not been changed. Meade wrote, the Army was well concentrated and moving with all speed that the fatigue of the men would bear. This is roughly where the troops were at the beginning of the campaign, or the end of June, the beginning of the battle. Gettysburg here, Lee is starting to concentrate. Meade and Butterfield are at Taneytown, Maryland. Some authors have charged that Butterfield was slow in issuing orders to concentrate the Army at Gettysburg. The orders didn't go out until a day or day and a half later, and that was his fault. But on the afternoon of July 1st, Meade and Butterfield rode over to the 2nd Corps headquarters to talk with General Winfield Scott Hancock. Meade ordered Hancock to go to Gettysburg to determine whether the Army should concentrate there or behind the Pipe Creek line that he had already previously laid out and where the other corps were destined to go. So on the afternoon of July 1st, Meade hadn't even made that decision yet. So how could it be communicated to anyone? Hancock says he doesn't arrive to Gettysburg until 3 or 3:30. It probably was more like 4:30, but in any case, the written report he sends to Meade has a date of 5:25 p.m. So given the speed of a horse and the distance to travel, probably Meade didn't get that report until 6:30, maybe even 7 o'clock at night. And then what does Meade do? Meade goes to Gettysburg to look for himself, to see whether the Army should concentrate there or not. So it's not until the late hours of July 1st or the early hours of July 2 that Meade even decides to concentrate at Gettysburg. So how could the order have possibly been issued before then? Some authors claim that a lot of the orders issued from Meade's headquarters on July 1st and 2nd were issued over the signature of Seth Williams. And that was because Meade didn't trust Butterfield. So he had Williams issue them. Well, Meade moved personally to Gettysburg on the evening of July 1. Butterfield stayed at Taneytown. This is a perfectly reasonable thing to do because all of the Corps and Division and Brigade commanders knew that headquarters was at Taneytown. So if you suddenly pick up and leave and people are sending messages there, you get there as a courier, well, there's no more headquarters, where do I go from here? So it's perfectly reasonable to stay there to communicate with all these different commands and let them know that you're moving to Gettysburg. Numerous messages to Corps commanders affirm this. This explains why. On late July 1, Seth Williams accompanied Meade to Gettysburg, so the orders Meade were issuing went out under Williams' signature late on July 1st and early on July 2, because it wasn't until later on the morning of July 2 that Butterfield actually shows up in Gettysburg. And of course, he resumes issuing the orders himself at that point. July 2, probably the most famous council of war of the war, takes place. Here we see Dan Butterfield sitting at a table taking notes. And again, this is where Butterfield's managerial experience really comes in handy. There's a general discussion going on. A couple of the generals are sleeping off in a corner somewhere. Everybody else is talking about what happened during the day. It's Butterfield that finally calls everybody to order and says, look, there's really 3 questions we need to answer. This is important because it focuses everybody's attention on decisions that need to be made. Again, this is Butterfield's managerial experience coming through. And he asked 3 questions. Is it advisable for the Army to stay here? If we stay, shall we take the offense or the defense? If we await attack, how long should we wait? Because of his management skills, Butterfield directs the attention to 3 important questions. But then he also asks for a vote on each one of them. The vote serves 2 purposes. It ends the discussion. All right, that's it. We're moving on to question number 2. But it also commits those people to that decision. So General X, if things don't go well, cannot say later on, well, I never supported that, because he's on record voting for it. Interesting. On the morning of July 3, Butterfield starts to rearrange the Union lines after the severe fighting on July 2. He sends an aide to make sure there's enough ammunition available in the artillery reserve. And then he meets with Quartermaster Rufus Ingalls and Meade to discuss what kind of orders need to be sent out for the day. At that time, a Confederate artillery shell explodes. A fragment of that shell, 1.43 pounds, hits Butterfield in the left chest just below his heart. He's knocked to the ground and carried off to a field hospital. He's still conscious. There's no apparent bleeding, but clearly he had the wind knocked out of him. They were fearing that he might be suffering from a concussion and internal injuries, and he certainly was not feeling very well. Some of his friends picked up the fragment and later attached a little plaque to it and gave it to him as a souvenir, and here it is. So you can see he clearly was not hit with the jagged edge. He must have been hit with the rounded part of the shell, and probably by the time it hit him, it had lost some of his velocity, otherwise he'd be dead. While the campaign is still going on, Butterfield gets a 30-day leave to recuperate. Meade writes to him, I shall never cease to remember and to bear testimony to the efficient assistance you heartily rendered me, and without which I hardly know how I should have gotten through with the new and arduous duties imposed on me. Then he appoints Humphreys to replace Butterfield. Now, Butterfield writes to him essentially saying, whoa, I read about Humphreys being chief of staff. What about me? What should I do when I recuperate? And Meade writes back a very nice letter. Hope you're doing well. Obviously the campaign's going on. I still had to appoint somebody. Butterfield writes back and says, well, that's all well and good, I understand, but what should I do when I'm recuperated? And then Meade gets kind of snotty and says, well, I don't know. Why don't you go to Washington, D.C. and see if they have something for you? Not very nice. Captain Tremaine writes, although he was not the commander of the Army of the Potomac, so far as the Chief of Staff can be awarded credit, the work of General Butterfield as Chief of Staff of the Army of the Potomac is entitled to an exceptional place in the history of that famous army. After Gettysburg, the Union Army is south of D.C. Confederates are besieging Chattanooga. Butterfield is without a command. So is Joe Hooker. So the government takes Joe Hooker off the shelf and assigns him to lead the 11th and 12th Corps to Chattanooga to relieve the siege. And Hooker brings back Dan Butterfield as his chief of staff. By train, they moved the Army to Indianapolis and then south into northern Alabama. In 11 and a half days, 17,500 men, 10 entire batteries of artillery, over 700 wagons and ambulances, over 4,400 horses and mules, the baggage of 2 entire Army Corps, travel over 1,100, almost 1,200 miles of rail in 11 and a half days. That was the largest, fastest movement by rail in the history of the world at the time. And it was Dan Butterfield who managed it. He becomes chief of staff to Joe Hooker at Chattanooga. Here's a picture of them in Chattanooga. Butterfield's role is managing the movement west. He briefly led a division to clear out Confederate raiders to open a supply line north into Tennessee. And then he planned the movement to relieve Chattanooga, and he planned the movement which was successful in capturing Lookout Mountain. Joe Hooker wrote to Butterfield, "You deserve for your promptitude, energy, and management a much higher reward than I can give you." In his final report, he wrote, "To conclude, I must express my grateful acknowledgments to Major General Butterfield, Chief of Staff, for the valuable assistance rendered me on the field." After Chattanooga, the 11th and 12th Corps are consolidated into the 20th Corps. So Butterfield is again without a position. Hooker says, "Well, why don't you come along as my Chief of Staff in the 20th Corps?" And Butterfield responds and says, "Well, I'm really not interested in being Chief of Staff. I want to have a Chief of Staff. I want a combat command." So Hooker gives him command of the 3rd Division in the 20th Corps. And with that, Butterfield held off as part of William Tecumseh Sherman's campaign against Atlanta. They get as far as Resaca, Georgia, Confederate lines, Union lines, Butterfield's position. Butterfield's division is moved to the far end of the Union line, and he's ordered to make an attack the next day on Confederate positions. Confederate positions roughly here. Butterfield's division roughly here. Now, I'm not sure if this is exactly where the charge was made, but it's pretty close. And you'll notice here that there are some areas of heavy brush, which if you're going to be attacking, it's going to take you a while to get through those. There's also a couple of fairly deep gullies that have to be traversed in order to make the attack. Butterfield sits back and he thinks. Usually there's an artillery bombardment. If we have an artillery bombardment, that's just going to tip off the Confederates that we're coming. Usually we send out skirmishers first to clear the way. But if we do that, the Confederates are going to know where the attack is coming. So Butterfield, not having gone to West Point, thinks, in order for this to be successful, we got to get across this field as fast as we possibly can. So he orders his troops not to shoot, to run like hell, and once they get in the Confederate works, then they can shoot. They do. They're successful in penetrating and capturing all 4 Confederate artillery pieces. And here's an interesting drawing that appeared in Harper's Weekly. You can see in the back little puffs of smoke. That's the main Confederate line. The troops captured the outlying line where the battery was, and then the Confederates from the main line started shooting at them. So they brought up shovels and pickaxes and dug a hole that you can see here, and then with grappling hooks grabbed the cannons and wheeled them out through that hole and captured them and took them down the hill. Rather ingenious. From Resaca, they head south toward Atlanta until June 29th, when Butterfield is taken to the hospital. He has malaria, diarrhea, exposure, and sunstroke. He goes on 30 days leave. George Thomas writes, "From what I have myself seen of the manner in which Butterfield handles his troops and his good conduct in battle, I take pleasure in recommending him for a corps." Sherman writes, "Butterfield is zealous and full of knowledge." And to Butterfield himself, he writes, "I regret exceedingly that you are forced to leave, as we cannot well spare you." Pretty high praise from 2 very good generals. Butterfield participated in 28 battles and 15 skirmishes. He was awarded brevets to Colonel, Brigadier General, and Major General in the regular Army, a major feat for a non-professional officer. The rest of the war, he commands a recruit depot in New York City, and also commanded the troops sent there to maintain the peace during the election of 1864. He stays in the Army until 1870, when his father passes away, and he then resigns to take over the running of the family businesses. He was one of the founders of the Grand Army of the Republic, the Union Army Veterans Organization. Here's a picture of him with Dan Sickles and James Longstreet at the 25th commemoration of the Battle of Gettysburg. 1890, here's a picture of him decked out with the Medal of Honor around his neck, and then different Corps badges. And this last one on the right being the Sons of Union Veterans, I'm sorry, Sons of Revolution, because his ancestors fought in the American Revolution. After the war, New York State gave $1,500 to each regiment and battery to erect a monument to itself at Gettysburg. By this time, the 12th New York didn't exist, but veterans of the 12th had been amalgamated into the 44th. So Dan Butterfield, New York provided $1,500. Dan Butterfield doubled it out of his own pocket on the condition that every soldier in the 12th and 44th New York who served at Gettysburg would have their name inscribed on the monument. And if you go there today and look inside, they are. His wife added $500, and the two of them together raised $20,000 to erect one of the largest monuments on the entire battlefield, state monuments. Any idea what the equivalent of that would be? You know, you realize there's been a little bit of inflation since then. What would it be?
100 grand.
$1.98?
No, 100 grand.
Ah, okay. The actual equivalent today would be $678,000 in 2024 U.S. currency. Well, that was a few days ago. I'm not sure. It may be another million by now. And this is fundraising he undertook himself. He also paid for out of his own pocket. Now, obviously, he's a rich guy. He paid for out of his own pocket this monument to the 5th Corps that he led at Fredericksburg. How many generals do you know that paid for a monument to their troops out of their own pocket? Much less one who paid for a monument to the troops in a battle they lost. Yeah. Butterfield suffered a stroke in 1901. Before he passed away, he told his wife he really wanted to be buried at West Point. Under the rules at the time, you could not be buried at West Point unless you were a graduate. So his wife contacted the Secretary of War, Elihu Root, who just happened to be from Utica, New York, the same place as Dan Butterfield. And Root said, well, okay, as long as the superintendent doesn't object. So she contacted the superintendent, and he just happened to be from central New York also. So he said, no problem. So Dan Butterfield today has one of the largest monuments to anybody at West Point. And his wife in 1918 commissioned the noted sculptor Gutzon Borglum, who did the presidents on Mount Rushmore, to craft a monument to Butterfield. And if you're ever in New York City, you go to West 122nd Street, there is Dan Butterfield looking out over the city. So he authored TAPS. He authored the Union Army Training Manual. He was awarded a Medal of Honor for his bravery in combat. He received praise for leadership on the Peninsula and Second Bull Run. He covered the retreat from Fredericksburg. He was responsible for reorganizing the Army of the Potomac twice, after Chancellorsville and after Fredericksburg. He came up with the idea of unit patches. He managed the concentration at Gettysburg. He managed the largest movement by rail in history at that time. He was prominent in the relief of Chattanooga. He also, one thing that we didn't talk about, a lot of generals advocated the recruitment of African American soldiers. Butterfield went a step further. Butterfield said, look, most of these people have never had a chance for education. So if we're going to recruit them, we ought to give them an opportunity after their service is over to be educated, and also we ought to take part of their monthly salary on a voluntary basis and put it in a fund that they can then have when they leave the service to either buy a piece of land or do something constructive to make up. Well, that didn't come into common usage for American troops until World War I. So he was way ahead of his time. He was praised for his leadership at Resaca, prominent in post-war veterans affairs, founder of the Society of the Army of the Potomac. He financed the monuments at Gettysburg and Fredericksburg. And he also gave liberally following the war to various causes. In fact, when the war was over, the Union Army general occupying New Orleans wrote to him and said, look, you know, there's yellow fever is here and there's other things and people are suffering and we don't have enough medicine. Butterfield sent a personal check of his own money for $5,000 for the relief of people suffering in New Orleans, Union, Confederate, civilians alike. Upon his death, the Old Guard Association in New York City said that his name would be inseparably linked from the great epoch in the history of the nation. So I thank you for your patience, and I thank you. I didn't hear anybody snoring, for which I am very grateful. If you have any questions or anything, I'm waiting for my hearing aid to arrive, so I'm a little difficult hearing people, but if you scream, I'll hear you. Thank you very much. Thank you.